Hello, my name is Chris Dunn, and I'm the owner and founder of Ascend Endurance Coaching. I'm also an exercise physiologist and an endurance athlete. This video series is designed to explore some of the basic science behind many of my training methods and philosophies. It is not meant to be a thorough review of the subject. It should also be noted that the material is based on an understanding of the science at the time of release. I hope you find it informative. Episode 1, the lactate threshold. The lactate threshold is one of the most widely used training theories currently in practice. It is also one of the most misunderstood. Nearly every endurance athlete has heard of it, yet few really understand the science behind it. And perhaps just as importantly, the training methods to improve it. Let's start with a basic definition. The lactate threshold is the fastest pace or effort that can be maintained before the ability to clear lactate is overwhelmed by the production of lactate. This imbalance leads to an overwhelming sense of fatigue and causes the athlete to slow down or stop. But before we explore why the lactate threshold limits performance, let's make sure we understand where the energy to exercise is derived. Energy systems. The things that get and keep you moving. Human movement is powered by three predominant energy systems. Let's take a look at them. All human movement is powered by the breakdown of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. This ATP is sourced from the following energy systems: the ATP-CP system, glycolysis, and oxidative mechanisms. For roughly the first 10 seconds of movement, ATP is derived from the ATP-CP system. This system provides a clean and readily available source of energy. But the reserves are very low, and if exercise is continued, other sources must be relied upon. These sources include glycolysis and oxidative mechanisms, which are activated at the start of movement and take on a larger role once the ATP-CP resources are exhausted. By definition, endurance sports are those that last longer than 2 minutes. And while oxidative mechanisms to generate ATP are the predominant energy source, it should be noted that glycolysis also plays a role. And its mechanisms help us to understand the lactate threshold. Without getting too deep in the biochemistry weeds, let's take a look at the steps of glycolysis. Glycolysis breaks down glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, to 2 pyruvate molecules, which are 3-carbon molecules. The reaction nets 2 ATP. But the reaction also creates something else important to our discussion: hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions are also referred to as protons. Their presence can lower the pH of the structures in which they are accumulating, resulting in these tissues becoming more acidic. Also, for our purposes, the other important result of glycolysis is the formation of 2 molecules of pyruvate. So with a focus for now on glycolysis, let's look at the 2 ways this reaction can generate ATP. As we've seen, glucose is converted to pyruvate and generates protons. During low-intensity exercise, pyruvate enters something called the Krebs cycle within the mitochondria of the exercising muscle, specifically within the slow-twitch or aerobic muscle fibers. The Krebs cycle generates ATP. But during higher exercise intensities, like when you pick up the pace or start to climb a hill, pyruvate is instead converted to lactate. The chemical reaction to convert pyruvate to lactate looks like this. There are 2 important things on this slide to focus on. The first is the generation of nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or NAD+. If you recall the chemical reactions of glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose to pyruvate requires NAD+. Therefore, the formation of lactate helps to continue glycolysis and, by extension, the higher intensity exercise efforts. But there's another important thing that happens during this chemical reaction that might completely change the way we think of lactate. When pyruvate is converted to lactate, a proton is consumed. So really, in a way, lactate doesn't cause the muscles to become acidic. It actually acts as a buffer by removing protons and helping to raise pH. So is lactate foe or friend? Well, we've just seen that lactate is a byproduct of glucose utilization by way of glycolysis. Although it consumes protons, it is typically produced during high-intensity efforts in which large amounts of pyruvate, and therefore hydrogen ions, are being generated and the pH of the active skeletal muscle is decreasing, therefore becoming acidic. So now that we know how it's produced, let's talk about where it's produced. During high-intensity efforts, fast-twitch muscle fibers are recruited due to the high contractile demands of the skeletal muscles. These fast-twitch muscle fibers consume a great deal of glucose, producing large amounts of lactate and therefore hydrogen ions. Although lactate is just a bystander, and perhaps some may say a good Samaritan, the increased production and accumulation of protons within the active skeletal muscle decreases the pH and may decrease muscle contraction velocity, peak force, and ultimately performance. So now with an understanding of what lactate is, where it comes from, and what the associated byproducts are, let's talk about how it impacts performance. It's important to reiterate that lactate is not the cause of acidosis in an active skeletal muscle. As it turns out, what it is a fairly good blood-borne surrogate measure for what's actually happening within the skeletal muscle. That is to say, when the blood lactate levels we collect during incremental exercise begin to increase rapidly, it's a fairly good indication that the coping mechanisms within the skeletal muscle are failing. By way of a quick review, lactate is mainly produced in fast-twitch muscle fibers. These fibers contain a high content of one particular transporter enzyme, which transports lactate away from these fibers. Conversely, slow-twitch fibers possess a transporter enzyme which brings lactate inside these fibers, where it is converted back to pyruvate inside the mitochondria and generates ATP. This lactate transport system therefore allows active skeletal muscle to handle its own lactate production and breakdown. It's worth mentioning that during exercise, some lactate is shuttled to the blood, where it's delivered to organs like the brain and heart, which use it for energy. Lactate is also shuttled to the blood to be delivered to the liver, where it's converted back to glucose through a process known as gluconeogenesis. Once in the blood, lactate can be measured. And because of the indirect relationship between blood lactate levels and the pH status of the active skeletal muscle, exercise scientists can conduct tests to see how athletes respond to increasing exercise intensities. This is an example of the data derived from a peak exercise test in which blood lactate levels were measured. Following the yellow line, you can see the blood lactate levels remain quite low and constant as exercise intensity increases. This is due to the reliance on non-lactate producing chemical reactions to generate ATP. At some point, however, the increase in exercise intensity, represented by oxygen consumption on the horizontal axis, will begin to shift the energy production toward the type of glycolysis that produces lactate. When the active skeletal muscle cannot adequately handle the increasing lactate load, it will begin to spill it over into the blood. This point is represented by the point of lactate threshold. At a slightly higher intensity, there is a second break point called the onset of blood lactate, and generally occurs around 4 millimoles of lactate per liter. But the lactate threshold alone does not tell the entire story. What's perhaps more important than this threshold value is the maximum pace an athlete can sustain for their particular sport or within their particular sport, while keeping lactate levels steady and just below this threshold. This pace is referred to as maximum lactate steady state and may be one of the most important performance determinants. It's interesting to look at the world record times within the sport of running and think about what the physiologic differences are between athletes. When lined up side by side, it would be hard to tell the marathoner apart from the 800-meter runner. Yet clearly these athletes have much different physical capabilities. It's arguable that the maximum lactate steady state of these athletes plays a very important role in their performance. Most elite 800-meter runners can easily run a mile in under 4 minutes and 41 seconds. Yet they cannot sustain that pace for 2 hours. Similarly, most elite marathoners can match the pace of a world-class 800-meter runner, but probably for no more than a lap. The world record efforts of these different athletes is based in large part on their sport-specific maximum lactate steady state. That is to say, the world record marathoner can sustain an average pace of 4 minutes and 41 seconds per mile over 2 hours without exceeding their lactate threshold, because they have steady rated with regard to their lactate threshold. So how do we improve the maximum lactate steady state and finish our next race faster? The answer may surprise you. To develop your maximum lactate steady state, you must do 3 things. Improve your ability to transport lactate from fast twitch fibers, improve your ability to transport lactate to slow twitch fibers, and once there, you must be able to use lactate aerobically to produce ATP. Lower intensity endurance training has the greatest potential of improving lactate clearance capacity and therefore increasing your maximum lactate steady state by increasing the number of mitochondria to clear lactate, mainly in slow twitch muscle fibers. These active recovery and endurance zone training units also increase the number of transporter enzymes that facilitate lactate into the slow twitch muscle fibers. Additionally, higher intensity endurance training as well as strength training may improve lactate clearance capacity by increasing the number of transporter enzymes that move the lactate away from the fast twitch fibers. So in short, while it's obvious that high intensity exercise must be a part of a maximum lactate steady state training program, what's not so obvious and often undervalued is the benefit of lower intensity endurance training to improve aerobic capacity. So here's an example of 2 common training units, active recovery and hills. Performed correctly, the active recovery training unit spends the majority of time in training zones 1 and 2. These training intensities primarily involve the slow twitch muscle fibers and help to increase the number of mitochondria. In contrast, hill work results in much higher heart rates, represented by the time spent in zones 3 through 5. These training intensities primarily involve the fast twitch muscle fibers and help to increase both types of transporter enzymes. A properly designed training program for most endurance athletes involves both types of training within the majority of time spent in zones 1 and 2. Of course, the common mistake that many athletes make is performing their easy workouts too hard, therefore missing out on an important opportunity to improve their maximum lactate steady state and therefore performance. So what are the key takeaways? Lactate is friend, not foe. Maximum lactate steady state is a key performance determinant. If your easy days are too hard, you'll miss out on important opportunities to improve performance. That concludes this episode. For more information about Ascend Endurance Coaching, please visit my website at www.ascendendurancecoaching.com. Be well.